Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, and in this lecture for today, we will be discussing new drug development and approval process. This lecture is very timely since it consists of the general process on how to get a new drug or a generic drug approved and why do we need to seek approval. So you can see on the screen the logos of FDA, Pfizer, and Moderna. This is very timely since we are in the time of pandemic and pharmaceutical companies are rushing to get their new drugs and treatments approved for use in the general population. So the Food and Drug Administration Act of 2009 is the latest law here in the Philippines that govern the regulatory activities of the Food and Drug Administration of the Philippines. The law requires that the FDA must approve a new drug before it may be legally introduced into the market. So this law applies to both locally made and imported drugs. So any drug, new or generic, must be first approved before it goes on to the market. This includes locally produced drugs or locally developed drugs, and this also includes foreign drugs or drugs made by multinational companies. So it does not matter where your drug originates from. It matters that it goes through the proper processes of our drug approval process before you can get the proper marketing authorization. So take for example, you are a multinational company who has already the drug approved in the foreign regulatory agencies. Take for example, your Pfizer and your drug is already approved by the US FDA. It does not automatically mean or guaranteed that your drug will also gain approval here in the Philippines. It is also true and that locally drugs that are approved by our local FDA are automatically approved by the foreign or US FDA. So take for example, our Coxa, Eternacoxib, is used here in the Philippines up to a dosage of 120 milligrams. However, in the United States, it's totally not registered, so you can't use it or import it into the United States. So you can see on the screen is the general form for an application for a pharmaceutical product. It contains the company's information together with a certain type of information and a complete information regarding the drug product. It may be a summarized form, however, attached with this form is several documents that need to be reviewed together with the application by our Philippine FDA. So a person who is allowed to represent the company throughout the drug approval process is called a regulatory pharmacist. So not every pharmacist could be a regulatory pharmacist. They just need to attend the FDA seminar on being a QPIRA, QPIRA. So QPIRA means qualified person in regulatory affairs. So only a pharmacist can actually represent the company when they are to have a drug product approved. So to gain approval for marketing, a drug sponsor must demonstrate that their drug, through supporting scientific evidence, that the drug or the drug product is safe and effective for its proposed use. Remember that the mission of the FDA is to guarantee that all approved drugs or drug products in the market is safe and effective. And they can guarantee this by properly reviewing the evidences provided by our drug sponsor. So the sponsor must demonstrate the various processes and controls used in producing the drug substance in manufacturing, packaging, labeling are properly controlled and validated to ensure that the product meets the established standards of quality. So what the drug company needs to prove is safety, effectiveness, and quality. So it's not only about the pharmacologic aspect of the drug, but also its manufacturing aspect as well. So next, we have the general process of drug approval. So the process and time course for drug discovery to approval can be lengthy and tedious, but are well defined and understood in the pharmaceutical industry. So being or making a new drug and trying to market it to a certain country is actually very tedious, especially if you haven't conducted any of the tests yet. So to establish a new drug, it is very lengthy in time and very expensive economically. Because as you see on the left side of your screen, these are all the processes you need to get your drug through, and you need to also have positive results regarding these tests. So let us go through the different processes. First, you have your new chemical entity or the new source of your drug. First, you have to develop a way how to isolate it from plants or how to synthesize it from other compounds. And you should also define how the original structure is modified to give the proper pharmacokinetic parameters. Next, you have your preclinical studies. So this includes the studies regarding the chemistry, the physical properties of your compound, the biologic properties of your compound, including its pharmacology, its pharmacokinetics, and also about its toxicology. So before you can even start testing it on humans, you first have to prove its pharmacology, meaning you have to prove that the drug works in animal models first. That's why animal testing is very important towards the pharmaceutical process, because you are not allowed to test on humans, especially if there's no guarantee of safety. So in animal testing, we both test the safety using toxicological screening and pharmacological testing on both animals and in vitro methods, such as different testing kits if you have a target enzyme. Also, you need to establish the proper pharmacokinetic parameters so you can have an initial dosing plan or an initial dosing schedule prepared. And you also have to start your pre-formulation stage. So in this pre-formulation stage, you have to have a formula ready, and you're supposed to test that specific recipe if all the components of the drug substance or the drug formulation is stable and it would not interfere in the safety of the drug product. So if you have passed the preclinical studies, you're going to submit an investigational new drug application, or our IND. So this is for FDA approval, and you are supposed to also continue your preclinical studies. So it's a continuation. These are more long-term studies. So as you get your INDA, so you're running the application process, you're also continuing the preclinical study. So this includes long-term animal toxicity, product formulation, manufacturing and controls, also finalizing the package and label designs. So after your IND has been approved, you can now start with the clinical trials. So clinical trials are tests done on humans to make sure that safety and efficacy are well documented and is very much there. So for phase 1 clinical trials, these are mostly safety trials. Phase 2 and phase 3 is when you're going to start giving the actual drug to some patients and try to see if the patient's conditions actually improve using this drug. So these clinical trials are the basis and the backbone for drug approval. If you failed these clinical trials, it's not the end of the world. You can actually change your application to treat another disease. So there are some drugs that have failed their clinical trials in a specific condition. However, they discovered during the clinical trials that it was able to treat another condition just by pure luck, and you can actually apply this towards another application. You do need to submit another IND first. So a good example of this is Viagra. So Viagra was supposed to be used for the treatment of certain cardiac conditions. However, during clinical trials, they observed that male patients had an increase in virility. And instead of continuing to produce the drug as a treatment for heart disease, they instead opted to change their approach towards treating erectile dysfunction. And this decision has actually brought Pfizer a lot of money. So if you actually watched Love and Other Drugs, that was the time period in which Viagra was very much booming. Okay. So let's say you have bypassed or you have passed our clinical trials. It's safe, it's effective, it works. Now you need to get to the new drug application. So this is what we call full approval. So in the new drug application, your drug will be evaluated again by the FDA, and it would be reviewed by an expert panel in the FDA. You would also be visited by the FDA to check your manufacturing processes. If you say in your application certain processes, when the FDA inspects it, the processes should be followed. And if you are blessed enough and the FDA grants you full approval, congratulations. You can now market your drug into the general public, and it can now be prescribed freely by doctors and be bought in the pharmacies. However, it does not stop there. You also need to continue with phase 4 clinical trials or post-marketing surveillance. It's called phase 4. It is also called post-marketing surveillance. So here you're going to conduct phase 4 clinical studies, including studies on adverse reactions. Since not all adverse effects might present themselves in clinical trials, given enough sample size, eventually certain side effects and adverse effects would present themselves in a large enough population. It might be 1 in 1 million, 1 in 10 million. And this process of detecting adverse effects that were not documented in clinical trials is called pharmacovigilance. So pharmacovigilance is a new field of pharmacy in which you're going to study approved drugs, check for any new adverse reactions, and if you could want to add new additional indications. So here is the general trend or the general or this is the summary of the whole FDA approval process. Okay, you start with synthesizing the compound, characterizing it, start with animal testing, move into clinical trials. If you get your product approved, you can get to market it, and if you're going to market it, you are required to have a pharmacovigilance team monitoring your drug use. So the approximate years or the approximate period for a drug towards approval is 15 years if there is no complications in the process. Most of the time there are setbacks, and it could actually last from 15 up to 60 years. So if you were able to discover a drug, you would be probably dead before your drug ever meets approval. And due to the large resources needed by clinical trials are very expensive. You have to pay the doctors, you have to pay the centers, you have to pay the researchers, you have to pay the patients, and take care of the patients if anything happens to them. That is why you will hear the term Big Pharma. And Big Pharma is actually the only ones who can develop a new drug. because of the large economic responsibilities attached to a new drug formulation. You also have to produce appropriate product inserts and packaging. So when we say a product insert, I think you have already seen one of this in your boxes of medicine. It's a neatly folded piece of paper that contains all the information related about the drug. So if a normal person would look at a product insert, most of the time they would not understand even a fraction of what is said. However, since you are a pharmacist, you should be able to understand every aspect of the product insert. So the content of a product approved labeling is represented by the package insert. It is a summary of the entire drug development process because it contains the chemistry, pharmacology, toxicology, indications, contraindications, adverse effects, formulation composition, dosage, and storage requirements that were developed during the research stages. Okay, so if ever you have a chance to read a product insert, please make sure to do so. If you don't actually have the time to read it, at least know what are the adverse effects so you can anticipate it better once it gets past you. Maybe you're going to be the one who detects an adverse effect related with that drug, and you could be actually the pharmacist that saves lives. Okay, so we have some special cases in the approval process. So special regulations do apply for certain new drugs to treat serious or life-threatening illnesses. Take for example, we have our vaccines. Most of the time, vaccines have the same approval process as a new drug. So why did it take 1 year, almost 1 year, to have it approved? Please do take note that there are some accelerated or fast track programs, especially in the time of emergency. Take for example, here in the time of pandemic, instead of going towards phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 in that order, they have conducted it simultaneously. So they conducted it in phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. So when the trials were over, they had data for all phases already. And since the FDA is pouring all of its effort in the new vaccines, the review time was actually shortened because of the sheer amount of experts working around the clock to have it reviewed properly. So the FDA did not actually became biased, or it did not actually became lenient towards the new vaccine makers. They just assigned more resources to focus on its approval, but they did not get an easy pass just because of it's a pandemic. Okay, the integrity of the FDA is solid. We should believe and trust in the FDA, even if what they do may be sometimes questionable in terms of public health. It is like the main office that protects our citizenry from drugs and medical devices, so that it could not be harmful nor it could not be ineffective. Okay, so that's an example of special cases like COVID. It is rapidly approved. So we have currently an emergency use authorization for most of our vaccines, and currently Pfizer was the first one to get a full approval. Okay, the difference between emergency use authorization is that EUA is not completely reviewed. What I mean is, not all of the data is present for EUA, but it has enough data to make a good call. But you cannot sell products under EUA, nor can regular persons buy it. If your drug has full approval, like the Pfizer one, regular persons can now purchase it from the pharmacy or somewhere else. And private companies are starting to buy Pfizer if their stocks are available. Aside from our vaccines, a good example is our drugs used to treat certain conditions that are rare and they have no current treatment. So If there are no satisfactory approved drugs or treatment alternatives for serious medical conditions, special protocols may be issued permitting the use of an investigational drug to treat some patients prior to the approval of a new drug application. So take for example, you have a drug in the pipeline. When we say pipeline, it is the general process of having your drug approved. You have a drug approved in the pipeline. It is intended for rare diseases and people are already dying. Okay? Already dying, already suffering. And you can apply your drug for a treatment IND. So a treatment IND is for certain drugs, especially used for orphan diseases, or these are sort of for orphan drugs, which are targeted for small number of patients who have rare conditions or diseases for which there are no satisfactory alternative treatments. So these are what we call experimental drugs. You can opt to take experimental drugs which have no full approval, provided that you are allowed by your local FDA. Okay? And if you want to know the certain conditions when we say orphan drug, when we say orphan drug, these are drugs used to treat diseases that are very rare or rare enough that it is not economic to develop a drug for that disease. If the disease only affects a small fraction of people, drug companies might not want to develop the drug just for those people, since the cost of development is so high and the return is so low, it might not be profitable at all. Okay, so if you want to check the treatment INDs currently in the market, you can go to this website here and you can look at the orphan drugs available. So you can change, if there are changes in your approved drug, it's always necessary for you to notify the FDA. So changes in labeling or formulation or change in manufacturer needs to apply for SNDA or supplemental new drug application. So this drug application is only sought when there are changes in formulation, changes in labeling, changes in indication, or changes in the manufacturing site. So if we have generic drugs do not need to apply for a full NDA. What the generic drugs are going through is called an abbreviated new drug application. So it is used to gain approval into a market for a duplicate generic product that is already approved. Take, for example, the patent has expired for a registered branded drug. You can now actually make your own. However, just because the patent expired doesn't mean you can copy the drug 1:1. You can only get the active ingredient, how the dosing is performed, and the properties of the drug itself. However, things like the formulation and the manufacturing process can still be kept secret by the original drug maker. So in these instances, you can use the ANDA, get the same drug, and develop your own formulation for approval. So you can't copy branded drugs 1:1, but you are allowed to use the active ingredient. So you need to document the chemistry, manufacturing controls, and bioavailability of the proposed product, and you should demonstrate biological equivalency to the original product. Okay, I'm going to say it now before we meet up in biopharmaceutics. Generic drugs or approved generic drugs are guaranteed by the FDA to exhibit same bioavailability. When we say they have the same bioavailability, they are bioequivalent. So what is bioavailability? Bioavailability is the rate and extent that a drug reaches systemic circulation. Basically, how much of the drug can be absorbed by the body. So if you can demonstrate that your drug product or your generic drug product can perform as good or better than the original maker of the drug, you can get your drug approved. Okay? One benefit of generic drugs is you do not need to go under clinical trials. Since the original drug maker has also already proved its efficacy and safety through clinical trials, all you have to do is to submit bioavailability studies, chemistry, manufacturing, and controls. Okay? So it's very cheap. That is why generic drugs are very cheap, because they need not produce clinical studies. They only need to demonstrate that their drug is as good as the competitor. Okay? That is why you can purchase paracetamol for 1 peso. So the FDA's definition of a new drug. A new drug is any drug that is not recognized as being safe and effective in the conditions recommended for its use in the labeling among experts who are qualified by the scientific training and experience. A drug need not be a new chemical to be considered new. A change in a previously approved drug product's formulation or a method of manufacture constitutes newness under the law, since changes can alter the therapeutic efficacy and safety of a new product. Okay. You can also consider a combination of 2 or more old drugs, or in a change in the usual proportions of drugs in an established combination. It is also considered new if the change introduces a question of safety or efficacy. And a proposed new use for an established drug, or a new dosage form, or a new dosing schedule, new route of administration, or a new dosage form makes a drug or product status new and triggers reconsideration for safety and efficacy. Okay? So to be considered new, you most of the time the basis, if there is enough change to warrant questioning the safety and efficacy, it is considered new. Okay. So for supplemental new drug applications, a sponsor of an approved NDA may make changes in the application through filing of an SNDA. Depending on the changes proposed, some require FDA approval before implementing, while others do not. Among the changes requiring prior approval, meaning these are changes you cannot make before the FDA approves, includes a change in the method of creating the drug substance, use of a different facility to manufacture the drug substance, in which the facility has not been approved through inspection for CGMP within the previous 2 years, a change in formulation, analytical standards, method of manufacture, or in-process quality controls, use of a different facility or contractor to manufacture, process, or package the product, change in the container and closure system for a drug product, extension of the expiry date for a drug product based on new stability data, and any labeling change that does not add or strengthen on a previously approved label statement. Okay, so moving on to the International Conference on Harmonization of Technical Requirements for Registration of Pharmaceuticals for Human Use, or basically ICH. So when you hear the term ICH, this is basically an organization or a group of regulators trying to standardize technical requirements for drug approval. What this benefits registration is, if you are ICH compliant and the drug came from an ICH compliant country and it is approved there, the company would have an easier time to get their drug approved since you have the same technical requirements. So example is, you're applying, a good example is, you're a student, or you are a student, and you're applying to 3 different schools. Those 3 different schools, if they are members of the same organization, they should require the same requirements. Okay? Meaning what you have can be used for 3 schools. If they are not part of the same organization, they may require different requirements, and they may require you to prepare different requirements for each application, which makes it more complicated. So this is the role of ICH. So in the recognition of international marketplace for pharmaceuticals, the regulatory agencies and the pharmaceutical industry, FDA, counterpart agencies in the EU and Japan, and other representatives in other regions have formed an organization called ICH. And the ICH main purpose is to establish a uniform set of standards for drug registration within these geographic areas. So being an ICH member will benefit your country since more drug companies would be more inclined to register their drug product in your country since you have the same standards as other countries. So the ICH's work on uniform standards is focused on three general ideas: quality, safety, and efficacy. And if you want to check out the different ICH guidelines, please take note that these are guidelines, these are not rules. Each country may still make their own regulatory decisions, but if you're a country that is compliant with ICH, you need not worry since they usually incorporate ICH guidelines in the first place. Simply go to the ICH's website and check the different guidelines for different tests, standards, etc. Okay. So if you want and if you go to the website of ICH, check for stability testing. Okay. That's the one you will be using in the near future, stability testing in physical pharmacy. Okay. So that is all for my lecture. I hope you have learned something from me. And this is lifted from our book, Ansel's Pharmaceutical Dosage Forms and Drug Delivery Systems. The lecture is not totally 1:1 complete from the book, so I highly recommend that you still read the book. Okay, that will be all. Thank you for listening.